How does a writer read their screenplay for conflict?
A writer reads a screenplay for conflict by looking at the goal of a person and what are the barriers to that goal. And if there are no barriers to that goal, they have to create a barrier to that goal. And that creates the conflict. Now, the barrier could be a person, it could be an actual physical barrier, it could be nature, it could be the ocean, it could be a relationship that's going wrong. Whatever the barrier is to the goal, that person has to confront that barrier, and that's what creates the conflict.
So we want to establish that when, you said fairly soon into the actual writing of the screenplay.
Right. We would, well, it definitely has to be established by the end of the first act. What is the goal and what are the barriers to the goal? And we have to see the barriers in each scene as well. Even in the first part of the story, when we're just establishing who the character is and what the situation is, we have to see barriers in every scene. And the barrier can be, like we were talking about earlier, riding a bicycle down the street. It could be potholes. It could be a pedestrian jumping in front of the bicycle. It could be somebody jumping onto the bicycle. It could be a car hitting the bicycle. It doesn't matter what the barrier is, or it creates a conflict that your central character has to overcome. And this happens throughout the film. Usually there's a major barrier, a major antagonist that's preventing your character from reaching his goal. But it could be somebody that's not somebody, a larger issue. For example, it could be the war. Let's say it's Nazi Germany. The barrier is the other army. It's not an individual, but it is a barrier that creates conflict that your central character has to overcome. And we have to see some sort of conflict in every scene, or we don't have really a scene.
Can you give us examples of how writers can add conflict to scenes that are lacking conflict?
Yes. The conflict doesn't always have to be big conflict. For example, let's say that you and I are talking about what we're going to have for dinner. And you say, oh, you know, I'd really like Mexican food tonight. And I say, you know what? I've had so much Mexican food this week, I'd rather have Chinese food. Conflict, different goals. We have different goals. So we have to resolve that conflict. How do we resolve that conflict? We talk about it. Well, why don't you want to have any Mexican food? I've had it every night this week. Why don't you want to have Chinese food? Because it gives me hives, or whatever it is. How about if we have sushi? So a resolution has to come up. You have to make a suggestion. Now, you can apply that to any situation. The conflict doesn't have to be big conflict. It doesn't have to be a fight. It can be anything, as long as there's a difference of a goal. If you have different goals, then you have conflict. And you have to resolve that conflict one way or the other. Now, in every scene in a movie, doesn't mean you resolve that conflict. Sometimes you lose. You just lose. You don't achieve the goal of that scene, and you have to move on. Or obviously you don't achieve the goal of the movie, because if you did, that'd be the end of the movie. So in the midpoint or any other point in the scene, in the movie, you have to understand that the conflict has to be small enough that your central character is going to survive, and big enough so that your character doesn't reach his ultimate goal. But there has to be conflict in every scene.
Do you find sometimes if you give a new writer a note, let's say a student, there needs to be more conflict, that they add way too much than the scene warrants?
Well, yeah, that doesn't happen very often. Usually they have to search for what the conflict is, or they will dump the scene. And I recommend if they can't figure out the conflict of the scene, just take it out and see if you can make the movie without that. If you can't make the movie without that, then put in the dinner suggestion, or put in clothing suggestion. I hate that blouse. You've got to change your blouse.
Sure.
And she'll say, well, what's wrong with this blouse? It's got nice lace on it, and it's got a nice neck on it, and my arms are out there. So there has to be a discussion. It's not a big thing, but it tells you who those people are.
Right. My ex-girlfriend used to wear that blouse. And that's the blouse that she wore when she went to Vegas with her ex-husband.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a reason not to like that blouse.
Right. Because I just thought, the dinner, okay, if we took the dinner scenario, What if there wasn't enough conflict in that? It was, I want this one, you want that one. Okay, well, it's not really too much of an argument.
Then we don't need that scene.
You don't need that scene.
It's not moving the story.
Okay.
It's not telling us anything new about those characters. But if it's telling us something new about those characters, like, I can't stand Mexican food because it gives me gas, and when I have gas, I get angry, that tells us something about the character. If it's, well, I just had too much Mexican food this week, that doesn't tell you very much about the character, but it does tell you something. Why have they been eating so much Mexican food that week? Well, because I can't afford anything else. I have to eat rice and beans because I can't afford anything else. Then that tells you something about that character. So in that case, you can keep that scene. If it tells us something about the character and there's a conflict there, then we can keep that scene. If it doesn't tell you anything about the character, we have to dump it.
Or when we go out to Mexican, I love it, but you have 3 margaritas and then you change on me.
Right.
And you swore you were just going to have Diet Coke.
Right. Well, there's an argument. And that tells you something about that character.
Right. So there we go.
There we go.
We're raising the stakes, which leads us to raising the stakes. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. If everything is easy and it's at the same level as we're going through the script, then it gets boring. So it has to be harder and harder and harder to overcome the barriers in every scene until we get to the final challenge, which is the biggest scene of the movie, and that is in the 3rd act, where your character has to overcome the hardest thing to overcome, whatever the protagonist is, if it's the volcano, if it's the ocean, if it's the swordsman, if it's the rifleman, if it's the wife who's about to leave, whatever it is, that person has to overcome whatever that big barrier is. If we have that big barrier in the 1st act, then the rest of it's going to be downhill and we're not going to be interested. So we have to have rising action, more and more difficulties as we go along. Otherwise, we waste it. If we have it early on, then there's no reason to see the rest of the movie. It's over.
Okay, so if let's suppose there's I don't know, alien invasion, don't put that closer to the beginning of the movie or in the midpoint. You would be more toward the end because that's what they were scared of the entire time? Or
no, not necessarily.
No?
You can have your alien invasion as the inciting incident. It's how they react to the alien invasion. We don't see them fighting it yet. We just see the aliens invaded. So now what do the people do about that? And they try something, they try shooting at it, it didn't work. They try setting off a bomb, that didn't work. They try setting off an atomic bomb, that didn't work. So what's the final challenge going to be? Well, I don't know what that is because I'm just making this up as I'm going along, but it has to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to deal with the alien invasion. But the alien invasion is the inciting incident. The goal and plan is to get rid of the alien invasion. The plan might be we're going to send missiles against it, or the alien invasion could be a bacteria. And that's a whole different thing. So how do we deal with that? And how do we deal with it in an ascending order? How does it get bigger and bigger and bigger? That's this problem that the screenwriter has to solve. And let me just say one more thing about screenwriting is that screenwriters solve problems. That's what they do. And there's a set of problems that come with every kind of story and every kind of person in the story. And the screenwriter has to solve problems. One of the things I did with my book recently is I wrote the character into a corner at the end of every chapter. And I had to solve the problem. I didn't even know the answer to the problem. I had to solve the problem in the next chapter. And then I wrote him into another corner so that I had to solve the problem. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until I solved the problem.
I love that. So, you've talked about giving things space or whatever. With this writing them into the corner and you didn't know, at what point would you start to figure out? Would they tell you what was going to happen?
That's a funny thing to ask, because you're so right. Sometimes the character will talk to me and dialogue comes out that I just, where did that come from? Or things happen, and you'll see, if you read the book, you'll see there's a very big surprise in one character that I didn't know until I wrote it. The word just came out. I thought, whoa, that surprised me. And that means that I knew that character and I knew that situation well enough to write it without even predicting it. It's hard to describe what happens. The brain takes over and you don't even know how it's going. Sure. I wasn't following an outline in that particular case. So when you're writing a script, you should know generally what's going on. I mean, you have your beat sheet, but you should be open to surprises as well, because the surprise can help you make it a little bit more interesting. And those surprises should be difficulties whenever possible. Something that's hard, something that makes it harder for your character. If it's something that makes it easy for your character, dump it. If it's a coincidence that makes it easy for your character, don't do it. But if it's a coincidence that makes it harder for your character, then do it.
So whether it's a novel or a screenplay, write them into corners, and the writer themselves should really not have a general idea of how they're going to get out of the situation?
Well, I wouldn't say shouldn't have. They should have most of the time, but allow themselves to be surprised. One person describes screenwriting as this. There's a person that climbs into a tree because there's a dangerous situation, and then you throw stones at that person until they figure out how to get down from the tree without getting killed. So this is what you do in your screenplay. You write a situation, you try to figure out how this person has to overcome each barrier along the way, but be open to creating new barriers or new ways to get out of those barriers. Instead of jumping down from the tree, maybe he climbs higher in the tree. Maybe he breaks off a branch and uses it as a spear. But let your character evolve while you're writing the character. Then you can go over it in your second draft or third draft and fix whatever needs to be fixed and set up whatever needs to be set up. Maybe you didn't set up that he knows how to make a bow and arrow out of a tree. You didn't set that up, but you showed that. You go back and you rewrite and you show him experimenting with a bow and arrow, or playing with a bow and arrow, or taking archery lessons, or whatever it is. And then that gives him the idea when he's in the tree to make a bow and arrow so that he can stop the person throwing stones at him. So you have to be open to invention as you go along. And sometimes your character will tell you what that invention should be. Sometimes they don't, but then you have your outline to proceed with.
If you don't hear that character voice, is this the wrong character for you?
Probably you haven't developed that character enough. That means probably the best thing to do would go back to your bio and figure out who that character really is. And if the character is not talking to you, then maybe you have the wrong character. Maybe you have the wrong story. You know, I haven't written to the end of every idea that I've gotten. Sometimes I will abandon a script when I just can't figure it out. And that's okay. You know, we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to achieve perfection with every script we write. Sometimes we just write crap. And sometimes we do that on purpose. Sometimes we have to do that because of the nature of the story we're doing or the nature of the program we're writing for. And I've done that. But sometimes you just write yourself in a corner and can't get out of it. And if that happens, sometimes you just have to give up. Now, if you're being paid to do that, that's a whole different story. Then you talk to people and you go back to your producer or the person that hired you and you say, look, I'm having a problem here. And you have to be honest and say, I wrote him into a corner and I can't get out. Do you have any ideas? And they may or may not like that idea that you come to them with and asking them for ideas, but tough. If you can't get out of it, you turn in a half a script, you're going to be up the creek anyway. So you might as well ask for help when you need it. Or you ask one of your trusted advisors, look, they want me to do this, but I wrote myself into a corner and I can't get out of it. What do you think? What can I do? And you talk it over. And eventually you're going to get an idea that's going to get you out of it.